75 years ago, a 4-year-old girl vanished from a small house in Brookings, South Dakota, disappearing completely into the freezing night, leaving her family plunged into grief and panic. Authorities quickly suspected a man who knew the family, one who had been in the area the very night Annie disappeared, but with no body, no solid evidence, and every lead dissolving into nothing, the investigation soon stalled. Yet through all those long years, one mother refused to believe the story was over. She clung to every thin thread of hope, convinced that somewhere the truth was still waiting to be uncovered. Then one day, when old seemingly useless evidence was re-examined with modern forensic technology, a crucial detail that an entire previous generation of investigators had missed suddenly emerged. A detail that turned the whole case upside down and shocked everyone who still remembered the story in a way no one could have imagined. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're hooked, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Late fall, 1949. Brookings, a small town surrounded by the wind-swept plains of South Dakota, was wrapped in its familiar dry, biting cold. Wind whistled through the cracks of old wooden doors, carrying the smell of damp earth and coal smoke from the houses along Main Avenue. In a modest home on the eastern edge of town, 4-year-old Annie Whitlow and her 6-year-old sister Mabel had been put to bed earlier than usual. A faint yellow nightlight cast a weak glow on the wooden walls, while a small table fan hummed steadily, soothing the two little girls against the cold, windy night. Mabel slept on the outside edge, facing away from the living room. Annie lay on the inside, clutching her worn cloth doll. The wind sweeping across the roof made the house tremble slightly, but nothing foretold what was about to happen. Around midnight, Mabel stirred, sensing someone standing near the bed. She opened her eyes slowly, still half asleep, and saw a tall, dark figure blocking the nightlight. The figure bent down and gently lifted Annie from the bed. In that brief glimpse, Mabel noticed a wide-brimmed dark hat and something about the hair or shadow beneath it that in her frightened, hazy state made her think of the strange characters from comic strips she'd seen. Terrified, Mabel pulled the blanket over her head, squeezed her eyes shut, and tried to convince herself it was just a confusing dream. By the time Mabel drifted off again, the wind outside had grown stronger. The wooden front door creaked faintly, but no one in the house woke to hear it. That night passed in silence, like hundreds of ordinary nights in this quiet little town. The next morning, around 7 o'clock, Eleanor Whitlow woke up to get ready for her early shift at the meat packing plant. She went into the girls' bedroom, pulled back the curtains, and checked on them as she did every day. But she froze. Annie was not in bed. The blanket was cold, and the doll lay on the floor. Eleanor called her daughter's name, her voice fading with each passing second. Before she could process what was happening, she hurried to the living room and saw the front door ajar, its hinges creaking in the morning breeze. This was completely wrong. Eleanor always locked the door carefully before bed, especially during the windy season. She ran through the house, flinging open every door, checking every corner, calling Annie's name in the backyard, hoping the child had just woken early and gone out to play. But there was no trace. Mabel, still sleepy, came out of the bedroom, and in her childish confusion, blurted out that a man had carried Annie away in the night. Eleanor went rigid, unsure how to react. The words of a 6-year-old could be innocent imagination, but a mother's instinct sent chills down her spine. Minutes later, Eleanor rushed inside, grabbed the phone, and dialed the Brookings County Sheriff. Her voice shook as she reported that her 4-year-old daughter had vanished overnight, and that a stranger might have taken her. Less than 10 minutes after Eleanor hung up, a Brookings County Sheriff's Office patrol car turned onto the dirt path leading to the Whitlow house. The early autumn sky was heavy and gray. Cold air rolling in from the fields made everything feel stifling. The first two deputies, Harris and Lang, stepped out and immediately noticed the still ajar front door. They knew this was no ordinary missing child case. They told Eleanor to leave everything exactly as it was, not to touch anything, then quickly began assessing the layout of the house. The small Whitlow home had a living room, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen at the back, and a rear door opening onto low prairie grass. On the north side was a small window where the night wind hit hardest. The deputies started in the girl's bedroom. The small double bed was pushed against the wall. The pale yellow nightlight was still on, looking oddly out of place in the cold morning light. A cloth doll lay on the floor, Annie's blanket dragged halfway off the edge. Details Deputy Harris immediately jotted down. Meanwhile, Deputy Lang examined the front door. The hinges were intact, no signs of forced entry, but the inside latch was flipped to the open position. Given Eleanor's habit of locking up every night, this instantly raised the question of whether someone had opened it from inside, or Annie had been carried out without making enough noise to wake her mother. After the initial walkthrough, they stepped into the front yard and spotted fresh shoe prints in the damp soil. Though faint, some appeared larger than Eleanor's or anyone else in the family. Harris marked the spots to preserve them for the lead investigator. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Arnold Kessler, the man in charge of the entire county, arrived with veteran investigator Marshall Conrad. Their presence turned the whole area into an instant crime scene. Neighbors began gathering, but deputies kept them back to avoid contamination. Marshall Conrad's first move was to interview Eleanor. He asked her to recount the entire previous evening in detail, when she put the girls to bed, when she locked the doors, whether she heard any noises, and exactly how the house looked when she discovered Annie missing. Eleanor's voice trembled as she described seeing the front door wide open. Every detail was recorded, even the seemingly unimportant ones. The lighting in the house, how strong the wind was, whether any outdoor sound seemed unusual. Next, Conrad spoke with Mabel. Though only 6, her account was the only direct witness to what happened at midnight. Conrad crouched to her eye level and spoke gently but clearly. Mabel said she saw a man in a wide-brimmed hat standing by the bed, who bent down and picked Annie up. She couldn't see his face because it was too dark, and she was so scared she pulled the covers over her head right away. When asked about smells, footsteps or a voice, she shook her head. She only remembered that he was really tall and moved really fast. From her statement, police highlighted 2 key points. The intruder entered the bedroom without making significant noise. He wore a distinctive wide-brimmed hat, rare in the residential areas around Brookings. After finishing the interviews, they examined all entrances and exits. Front door, opened from the inside. Back door, locked, but the ground outside showed indistinct footprints. Windows, no pry marks, though one curtain was slightly askew. They concluded the intruder likely entered through the front door, or an as-yet undiscovered approach. Marshall Conrad built a preliminary timeline of the disappearance. 7 p.m., girls put to bed. 10 p.m., Eleanor locks up and goes to sleep. Around midnight, Mabel sees the man carry Annie away. 7 a.m., Annie discovered missing. The window between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. was the blind spot, and Conrad immediately ordered teams to dissect every possible movement during those hours. From the timeline, search parties were deployed. Sheriff Kessler divided manpower into 3 groups. Group 1, sweep the dirt roads leading east into the fields. Group 2, check abandoned farms near the Big Sioux River. Group 3, search the backyard and brush along the fence line. He also set up coordination with Moody County Police in case the perpetrator fled by vehicle across county lines that same night. While teams fanned out, Marshall Conrad returned to the bedroom for a closer look. Natural light now revealed small details, drag marks on the blanket, children's footprints mixed with larger ones, faint scratches on the doorframe. He circled these areas and requested the forensics team collect samples as soon as the sheriff gave the go-ahead. Brookings, a peaceful town rarely touched by serious crime, fell unnaturally quiet. Police radios crackled non-stop, patrol cars rolled down old dirt roads, and the seasoned investigators' instincts told them this disappearance was anything but simple. A 4-year-old could not unlock a door and vanish into a freezing night on her own. Something deliberate had happened, and the first traces were only just beginning to surface on that bleak morning. The real investigation had begun. The line of reasoning Marshal Conrad developed at the Whitlow house was quickly turned into action on the ground. Officers waiting in the yard were ordered to fan out into the surrounding area, widening the search along routes the topographic map suggested the perpetrator might have taken. The morning air remained thick with cold. Weak sunlight filtered through a thin veil of fog over the eastern fields, making the whole area look shrouded in pale gray. Search teams were reorganized according to the sketch Conrad had marked on the map: the prairie behind the house, the patchy woods stretching northwest, and the dirt road leading straight to the Big Sioux River. These were vast open areas with few homes, perfect for someone wanting to leave town unnoticed. Conrad instructed each group to advance in a straight line, shoulder to shoulder, sweeping every inch of ground. The first team moved into the fields behind the Whitlow house, where golden grass and soft soil tended to hold tracks better than paved roads. Scattered patches of flattened grass appeared, but the pattern was broken. They could be hurried adult footprints, or just the work of last night's strong wind. The team marked the spots, but couldn't yet draw firm conclusions. Local farmers who volunteered, familiar with the terrain, helped check drainage ditches and natural depressions, where a child might have gotten stuck in the dark. Everything was empty. The second team headed west, toward a string of abandoned barns scattered across open land. The old darkened wooden structures had iron-barred doors, and thick dust on the ground showed no recent activity. Behind one barn, however, the low grass bore strange compressed patches, as if someone had stood there for a while. Police photographed and marked them, then compared wind direction and shadows to estimate timing, but everything remained speculative. The third team was given the most critical task, heading toward the Big Sioux River. The dirt road from the Whitlow house to the riverbank was just over a mile, far enough to avoid neighbors' notice, close enough for quick access at night. Team members scrutinized every meter of soil, every tree trunk, every soft footprint along the floodplain. Several clear adult-sized boot prints appeared in the damp earth, deep impressions suggesting hard-soled shoes. Yet this route was commonly used by locals for fishing or checking muskrat traps, so they couldn't yet tie the prints to Annie's abductor. The atmosphere along the river grew heavier whenever the wind died down. Slender trees along the bank swayed with the current, producing a steady, eerie whisper. Officers probed the water's edge with sticks and long poles, checking anything that might have washed ashore, but nothing indicated Annie had ever been there. On the map, Conrad pointed to the low forest between Brookings and Moody County, an area of rough terrain laced with unofficial trails made by woodcutters. An abductor could easily cut through the trees to avoid detection. 2 additional small teams were sent in, following the trails and checking every clearing between trunks. Morning dew still clung to the ground, making footprints harder to spot, but occasionally they found sections of heavily compressed soil, suggesting an adult had passed through. No one dared confirm anything. Those marks could be days old and unrelated. While search teams spread across the region, Sheriff Kessler coordinated via radio, ensuring no overlap and no gaps. Conrad stood beside him, cross-referencing Mabel's description with the actual terrain. If the man wore a wide-brimmed hat and was very tall, he probably didn't carry Annie far on foot. Moving a small child in the dark risked noise or stumbling. This made Conrad focus on flatter routes, such as the dirt road toward Moody County. Scattered small items turned up: a torn scrap of paper blown to the edge of a field, an old cigarette butt near a northern trail, a few unnaturally broken branches. Yet nothing tied directly to the disappearance. In 1949, there was no DNA testing, no microscopic fiber analysis. Every conclusion rested on visual experience alone. The entire morning passed without a single solid lead. Soaked boots, jackets coated in grass dust, and increasingly tense faces showed no one still thought this was a child who had simply wandered off. The silence stretching across the plains, broken only by wind-rattling trees, or the intermittent crackle of radios, only heightened the unease. Late in the day, Sheriff Kessler decided to extend the search into the next day and expand into Moody County. At the same time, he ordered Conrad to compile a list of men known to frequent the areas around the Whitlow house, especially anyone who habitually wore a wide-brimmed hat matching Mabel's description. That list would become the parallel focus of the investigation, while the physical search for Annie continued over an ever-widening area. A gloomy afternoon settled in, and though dozens of people still combed every trail and patch of ground, everyone felt the same thing. This disappearance was growing bigger than anyone had imagined. The landscape around Brookings felt vast and empty, as if something still hidden lay somewhere among the prairie grass, sparse woods, and the misty banks of the Big Sioux River. The search expanded into Moody County early the next morning. The teams were exhausted but pressed on. Every indicator suggested Annie may have been taken out of the Brookings area. Search parties pushed deeper into the lowlands where the terrain shifted to sparse woods, wet meadows, and sharply winding stretches of river. Early winter cold had settled in, hardening the ground and making any remaining traces from the night of the incident even harder to spot. Still, investigators knew that if Annie had been carried off in the dark, the riverbank areas could not be ignored. A 5-man team, 3 Moody County deputies and 2 local volunteers, worked their way along a slow-moving bend of the Big Sioux River, where drifting objects often washed up onto the grassy banks. One of them, Deputy Rowland, noticed a flock of crows repeatedly diving toward a spot several dozen yards inland from the sandbar. At first he thought it was animal remains, but training took over, and he walked closer to check. When he was near enough to see clearly, Rowland froze. A small shape lay on its side in waist-high weeds, visible where the grass had been pressed flat. He immediately raised a hand to halt the group and ordered them to preserve the scene. Beneath the grass lay the body of a little girl. The tiny frame was covered only by a few torn scraps of clothing, and the state of decomposition showed she had not died within the last 24 hours. Facial features were almost unrecognizable. The skin had turned gray and taut from cold and insect activity. The early winter weather had slowed extreme decay, but it also made identifying characteristics difficult. Deputy Rowland radioed Sheriff Kessler at once. Both Brookings and Moody County went silent for several seconds at the report. The phrase "little girl's body" was enough to tell everyone that hope of finding Annie alive had essentially vanished. The most seasoned investigators headed to the scene immediately. The riverside meadow was sealed off. Marshal Conrad circled the body clockwise without touching anything, noting evidence. The surrounding grass was bent inward from the riverbank, suggesting the body may have drifted ashore and become lodged. Yet the child lay on dry ground with no water around her, meaning some time had passed since she was at the water's edge. A few slide marks in the soil indicated someone, or the current, had pushed the body to its present position. There were no identifying items, no shoes, no papers, nothing belonging to a child except the shredded pajama scraps. That detail caught Conrad's eye. The fabric and color, pale pink with white trim, matched Eleanor's description of the night clothes Annie wore the night she vanished. The torn and soiled condition, however, made visual confirmation nearly impossible. On-site forensic personnel estimated decomposition consistent with 24 to 48 hours post-mortem. That timeline matched Annie's disappearance but was not conclusive. On one shoulder Conrad noted small curved bite marks, not clear enough to identify the source, but highly unusual for a child who died in the wild. The body was carefully wrapped, placed on a stretcher, and transported back to Brookings for formal autopsy. In the county morgue, Dr. Stanley O'Connell, whose 20-plus years of experience included many child victims, began the examination. He measured long bones, estimated height, and examined dental structure. Age between 3 and 5 years perfectly consistent with Annie. External trauma included minor bruising on arms and legs, slight injury around the mouth, and the shoulder bite marks. No fractures, no clear lethal blunt or sharp force trauma. Cause of death was listed as undetermined pending further analysis. There were no obvious signs of direct violence. O'Connell suspected asphyxia or hypothermia if the child had been left outside on a cold night. While examining the remaining clothing fragments, the doctor found a small piece of pajama fabric stuck tightly to the left upper arm. Though tiny, the color matched Eleanor's description of Annie's nightgown. Additionally, a single long dark brown hair, not matching the victim's hair color, was tangled in the child's hair. It could belong to the perpetrator or have attached during transport of the body, but it was preserved as evidence. Since positive identification was impossible with 1949 technology, the remains were officially recorded as Child Doe 1949. Some investigators could not hide their disappointment at the designation. In their minds, this was almost certainly Annie. Until family confirmation or other conclusive proof, however, procedure had to be followed. Marshal Conrad took one last look at the small body before leaving the morgue. He knew every child case began with the tiniest traces, bite marks, a hair, scraps of cloth, details that seemed trivial. He also knew this missing child investigation had taken a completely different turn, from hope of recovery to hunting whoever carried a child out of the Whitlow house on that frigid night. The next hours of the investigation would hinge on piecing these fragments together into a clearer picture. But that was still far off. Brookings, accustomed to quiet, now faced its first shock, and it was only the beginning. Before the Child Doe 1949 autopsy was even complete, Marshal Conrad returned to the Whitlow house intent on fully reconstructing everything that happened the night Annie disappeared. Finding the little girl's body forced him to re-examine every detail inside the home, especially the sister's bedroom, where the first truth had begun to surface. No further progress was possible without understanding exactly what took place within those four walls. Small bedroom, old wooden floor, double bed pushed against the east wall. Conrad cleared onlookers, closed the door so interior light matched the moment Mabel woke in the night, and turned on only the faint yellow nightlight, the sole illumination Mabel had when she opened her eyes. In that dim glow, a tall adult standing beside the bed would block most of the room, making facial identification impossible for a 6-year-old roused from sleep. When Conrad positioned an officer of similar height to Mabel's description, a large man in a wide-brimmed hat, next to the bed, he saw that if the man bent slightly, the light shone from behind and created total shadow. This explained why Mabel could not describe the perpetrator's face. Everything she saw was lost in the silhouette cast by the weak bulb. It also established the limits of her observation. She could recall overall shape, the big hat, height, but not hair color, clothing color, or facial features. The next phase required determining Eleanor's exact position at the critical moment. From her initial statement, she was asleep next door with the door closed, exhausted after a long shift. The old wooden house had poor sound insulation, yet when Conrad tested light footsteps on tiptoe, the noise was minimal. An adult walking on the balls of their feet could easily go unheard by Eleanor. Opening the front door gently produced only a faint hinge squeak, unlikely to wake anyone at midnight. The most critical step was building a more precise timeline. Conrad opened his notebook and combined every piece of data from Eleanor, Mabel, neighbors, and the scene. 7 p.m. Both girls put to bed. 10 p.m. Eleanor checked and locked the front door, house quiet. Sometime after midnight, likely 1 a.m. Mabel saw the man carry Annie away, bedroom nightlight still on. After that, no one in the house heard any loud noise. 7 a.m. Eleanor discovered Annie missing and front door unlocked open. Conrad narrowed it to two possibilities. The perpetrator entered before midnight, hid in the dark, and took Annie when ready. The perpetrator approached after midnight, opened the front door from outside, and went straight to the bedroom. Both needed rechecking, but the large shoe prints in the yard and the unlocked front door tilted Conrad toward the second scenario. The perpetrator parked, or walked up to the house, acted very quickly, and was gone before dawn. With the timeline stabilized, police returned to the list of local men who could match Mabel's description. At the top was Eleanor's recent ex-boyfriend, a tense relationship that had ended months earlier with occasional arguments, enough for law enforcement to place him high on the suspect list, just behind complete strangers. Conrad visited the man late that afternoon. He appeared shocked at the news of Annie's disappearance. Though flustered, he insisted he had nothing to do with it, and provided a detailed alibi. He had been at an auto repair garage around 8 p.m., then drove to a friend's house in Dual County, and spent the night. Conrad did not accept the story at face value. He checked distances, travel times, and the possibility of driving back to Brookings in the night, and returning unnoticed. 2 officers immediately went to the friend's address. The friend confirmed the suspect was there all night, from about 9 p.m. until 7 a.m. They had even stayed up listening to a late-night radio program together until it ended. It was a solid alibi. Police still documented every detail, checked clocks at the gas station, and calculated travel times. Nothing indicated the man had left Dual County that night. When Conrad compared this with Mabel's description of the wide-brimmed hat, suspicion dropped further. The ex-boyfriend never wore that style of hat, and was not known to smoke. Yet cigarette butts had been found near the Whitlow window. After several hours of verification, Conrad officially removed Eleanor's ex-boyfriend from the primary suspect list. This narrowed the focus to lesser-known men who had been seen around the Whitlow place, passing barn workers, roof repairmen, or seasonal farm hands. At day's end, Conrad returned once more to Annie's bedroom, looked at the rumpled little bed, the cloth doll still in place, and wrote his final lines in the notebook. Whoever carried Annie away knew exactly what he was doing, when to enter, and how to leave before anyone heard. He was not flustered, he had experience, and he had stood inside this house before. Those notes unknowingly opened the next investigative path, leading police to the first name that would remain in the case file for a very long time. Harold McDowell. The final notes Marshal Conrad left in his notebook that day did not stay dormant long. The condition of the room, and the precise way Annie was taken convinced him the perpetrator was not a random passerby, but someone who may have previously entered the house. That instinct drove him back to the scene, the very next morning, this time specifically looking for traces the initial search might have missed. The Whitlow house was completely isolated. Doors locked, curtains drawn to replicate nighttime light levels. Conrad had all lights turned off, except natural daylight, stood still until his eyes adjusted to the dimness, then began re-examining every corner. He moved from living room to hallway, to the girl's bedroom, tracing the quietest path an intruder could take. His attention stopped at the rear window, which had shown no obvious signs the day before. Morning sunlight slanting across the frame revealed a faint smudge on the wooden edge, as if someone had braced a hand there while opening or pushing the window. When Conrad lightly dusted it with graphite powder, a fingerprint emerged clearly. It was not a child's print, and did not match Eleanor's. Large, long ridges, definitely an adult male. The fingerprint discovery elevated the rear window's importance. The perpetrator may have entered through it, rather than the front door, or at least touched it while surveilling the interior. Conrad immediately ordered photographs and manual preservation of the frame, to protect any remaining prints. On the ground directly beneath the window, he crouched and picked up several small items that did not belong naturally. 2 Camel cigarette filters, with ash scattered to one side by the wind. They looked fresher than typical rural litter paper, not rotted. Tobacco fibers, still bright yellow. Finding 2 filters together right under the window was highly unusual. Most likely someone had stood there watching in the dark. The items were sealed and taken to temporary storage. Although 1949 offered no DNA testing or precise tobacco source analysis, Conrad knew brand preference and smoking habits could still be vital clues in small communities, where everyone recognized who smoked what. The recovered print was immediately sent for manual comparison. First Brookings County records, then copies to surrounding departments in Moody, Dual, Kingsbury, and Minnehaha, in Sioux Falls. Each agency compared it against existing files, seasonal workers, minor theft arrests, etc. Everything was done by hand, matching ridge by ridge. There were no automated systems like decades later. It all depended on human eyes. While waiting, Conrad reviewed everyone known to have entered the Whitlow house in the past year. The list was short: stove repairman, porch roof fixer, a few traveling salesmen, an electrician, and the man who rebuilt the horse barn after last year's storm, Harold McDowell. The moment he read the name, Conrad felt the familiar click of connection. Harold was tall, thin, wore a sparse but long beard, and was famous for his black wide-brimmed hat, practically part of his identity. When Conrad re-interviewed Eleanor that afternoon, she confirmed without hesitation Harold had worked 2 full days in the backyard, walking repeatedly around the house. He had every reason to be near the windows and walls. The physical match with Mabel's description, a tall man casting a large shadow, wide-brimmed hat, was chilling. Just 1 day later, Minnehaha County reported back. The rear window print bore very strong similarity to fingerprints taken from Harold McDowell's 1947 temporary labor record after a bar fight. Not a perfect match, the scene print was partial, but the correspondence was extremely high. Conrad immediately gathered Harold's whereabouts the night Annie vanished. Harold claimed he had been at his cousin's farm on the edge of Brookings, staying overnight after a few beers. When police checked with the cousin, the story faltered. The cousin was vague about when Harold arrived, and even said he might have fallen asleep first. The inconsistent alibi raised suspicion significantly. That Harold smoked Camels, the exact brand found under the window, was also confirmed by Eleanor. While working on the barn roof, he chain-smoked, dropping filters at his feet. The mix of tobacco and damp wood smell stuck in her memory. Piece by piece, everything lined up. Tall man in a wide-brimmed hat. Had been inside and around the house, familiar with its layout. Smoked the same brand found at the scene. Fingerprint, with high similarity. Shaky alibi. All of it made Harold McDowell the first genuinely substantial suspect in the case file. Though evidence was not yet enough for an arrest, Conrad knew gathering every trace connected to Harold would determine the next steps. From that moment, Harold's name received its own dedicated page in the file, with a line Conrad circled in red: primary suspect, place under surveillance. The questions swirling around Harold McDowell pushed Marshal Conrad to expand the investigation in the next direction, reconstructing the route the kidnapper might have taken to carry Annie away from the Whitlow house, then comparing it with Harold's movements and ability to travel on the night of the incident. The discovery of the little girl's body beside the Big Sioux River was a critical marker, and Conrad needed to determine whether the perpetrator had the time, the capability, and the knowledge of the terrain to get Annie there before dawn. Conrad stood over the map spread across the table and drew a straight line from the Whitlow house to the spot in Moody County where the body was found. The direct distance was not great, little more than 2 miles as the crow flies, but reality was far more complicated: winding dirt tracks, soggy meadows, small creeks, and treacherous stretches right along the riverbank. To simulate it accurately, Conrad had to walk the ground himself. The team immediately set out from the front door of the Whitlow house, following 2 routes. The first route cut straight across the eastern meadow toward the Big Sioux River. The second route followed the main dirt road around, dropped into the lowlands, then traced the local trails people actually used. In theory, the first route looked fastest, but in practice it was impractical: soft ground, tall grass blocking the view, multiple small streams to cross. If the kidnapper was carrying Annie in his arms, taking this route in pitch darkness would have been nearly impossible, unless he knew every inch of the terrain. Conrad noted it clearly: the perpetrator very likely knew every foot of ground in the area. The second route was far more feasible. The dirt road from Brookings to Moody County was wide enough for a vehicle or a man on foot. If the perpetrator used a car or a horse-drawn wagon, this route made perfect sense. The road led to a small fork, and then merged into the area where the body was discovered. Conrad and the officers took nearly an hour to complete the journey, a reasonable time frame if measured from when Harold could have left the Whitlow house until it was still dark. Next, Conrad needed to establish the feasibility of the time of death and the body's location. According to the autopsy report, death occurred within 24-48 hours, consistent with the time Annie went missing. The Big Sioux flowed at a moderate speed, but if the body had drifted from upstream, it would snag on grass or sandbars in the shallower sections. The spot where Child Doe was found was exactly such a place: slower current, plenty of natural debris that could catch a floating body. This meant the body could have been placed in the river farther upstream and carried to the discovery site. Conrad tested it by tossing a small log into the water upstream and watching its speed and where it lodged. The result was chillingly consistent. The object was pushed to almost the exact place the body appeared. Though it proved nothing definitively, the experiment increased the likelihood that the perpetrator reached the river at a more convenient access point and simply let the body drift. From there, Conrad began comparing this route with Harold's movements the night Annie vanished. His cousin's vague statement made verification unreliable. On top of that, Harold lived on the edge of Brookings and knew a shortcut locals used to Moody County. Conrad checked the ledger at a general store near Harold's home. The clerk confirmed seeing Harold the previous afternoon, but had nothing about that evening. It was neither proof nor exoneration. The investigation took an unexpected turn when the Brookings police received word from the Minnehaha County Jail. An inmate had sent a letter asking to speak with an investigator, claiming he had information about Annie's disappearance. Conrad immediately drove to Sioux Falls. The inmate, Roy Benner, was serving 3 years for theft. He said that a few months before his arrest, he had been drinking with Harold at a roadside bar near Moody County. While drunk, Harold supposedly bragged about picking up a little girl from her bed in the dark because she looked so sweet, then laughed loudly. Roy wasn't sure if it was true or just drunken rambling, but when he heard about the little girl's body being found, he felt he had to speak up. Conrad cross-checked every detail. Roy described Harold wearing a wide-brimmed hat, hard-soled boots, and smoking Camels, all matching what police already knew. But when Conrad pressed for more about what Harold said that night, Roy couldn't recall the context or pin down an exact date. That was the big problem. Testimony from a drunk inmate could not be used as prosecutable evidence. Still, the statement could not be ignored, because it accidentally lined up with these points. Harold frequently traveled between Brookings and Moody County, smoked the exact brand of cigarettes found under the back window, had a history of being in the Whitlow yard, matched Mabel's description of build and manner, had a plausible route to the body disposal site. Even so, tying all these threads into courtroom evidence remained out of reach. No direct witnesses, no clear physical trace, and the fingerprints were only similar, not a confirmed match. At the end of the day, Conrad wrote in the file, Harold McDowell, highly viable suspect, but evidence insufficient for arrest. Further investigation required before case reaches dead end. That note signaled the start of a new phase in the investigation, and the moment the file began to slow down, gradually sliding toward decades of cold storage. The tentative conclusions Conrad wrote at the end of the rote analysis made the whole team feel the deadlock closing in. Although many details pointed to Harold McDowell, the feasible route, the cigarette brand, the appearance, the inmate's statement, everything stopped at probability, not proof. And that razor-thin gap was what caused the investigation to stall day after day. Conrad kept combing locations along the Big Sioux River, hoping to find any additional physical evidence that could support the theory the killer brought Annie to the river before her body drifted toward Moody County. But early winter weather turned the ground hard and erased traces. The riverbank was battered by strong winds every day, leaving layers of flattened grass impossible to date. The river rose slightly, shifting sandbars and wiping away anything that might have remained from that night. The final searches of the natural crime scene ended in disappointment. Meanwhile, the identity of 1949 child Doe still could not be confirmed. In 1949, police had no DNA analysis, no microscopic comparison methods, no comprehensive pediatric dental records. The only identifiers, age, pajama fragment, body location, all matched Annie, but matching could not become confirmed. Forensic experts could not issue a definitive conclusion. The lack of positive identification left the entire investigative direction hanging. Every piece of evidence collected earlier began to feel like a burden. The pajama scrap was too small and torn to be distinctive. The fingerprints were only partially similar, not enough for legal standards of the era. The cigarette butts only proved the habit of smoking Camels, shared by hundreds of men in the area. Everything was stored in waxed cardboard boxes and crude envelopes inside a simple wooden cabinet in the Brookings County evidence room. No humidity control, no long-term preservation methods. Conrad knew time would degrade the evidence, but they had no better options. The investigation of Harold McDowell also ground to a halt. Conrad re-interviewed neighbors, former co-workers, and people who had seen him around the Whitlow place. Many confirmed Harold matched Mabel's description. Some even said he had a volatile temper. But all of it was speculation, not evidence. No one saw Harold that night. No one heard anything. No one found anything belonging to Annie in his house or vehicle. As time passed, possibilities never became prosecutable facts. Maybe remained forever not enough. Gradually, community fervor faded too. In the beginning, dozens of Brookings residents and Moody County volunteers scoured every clump of grass. By week 4, the search parties dwindled, then became sporadic. Everyone was heartbroken, but everyone had to return to life. Farm chores, harvest, factory jobs, school. In a rural town, daily rhythm did not allow indefinite pause. Sheriff Kessler called a full team meeting. Reports showed no new progress, no additional evidence, no new witnesses. Though he hated it, he finally made the hard call: the Annie Whitlow disappearance and the death of child Doe would be reclassified as a cold case. Conrad said nothing during the meeting. He quietly gathered his notes, carried the case box down to storage, and placed the wooden box on a high shelf among hundreds of other unsolved files. He affixed a new label in black ink: Whitlow child Doe, 1949. Unsolved. The evidence room door closed, leaving behind the smell of old wood and dust. Conrad stood there a long time before walking away. He knew the case was far from over in his own mind, but the investigative system of the era had reached its limit. There was no way to take another step. And so the Annie Whitlow disappearance sank into silence, a silence that would last decades, preserved only by a few fragile pieces of evidence and the unrelenting regret of everyone who took part in that first search. The box labeled Whitlow child Doe, 1949, unsolved sat undisturbed on the evidence shelf for decades, gathering thick dust. From the late 1950s through the 1970s, almost no one touched the file again. Investigative technology had not advanced significantly, and there was no reason to believe new leads would appear. But in the 1980s, a fresh wind began blowing through law enforcement, digitization of records, and imaging storage, reaching police departments across the country. Old paper and film cases became prime candidates for conversion. Brookings County was no exception. Around the early 1980s, when the state mandated counties review unsolved cases, Annie Whitlow's box saw daylight for the first time in over 30 years. Younger investigators who had never heard of the case opened it, read every report page, and looked at the faded photos of the scene and child Doe's body. No one expected breakthroughs. Their job was simply to digitize everything, re-photograph pictures, scan documents, copy fingerprints, and enter the entire file into the county's modern storage system. During the fingerprint scanning process, a small but significant turning point occurred. By the late 1980s, The AFS automated fingerprint identification system was being rolled out in many states. AFS allowed automated fingerprint matching across agencies, sometimes nationwide. Though the 1949 crime scene prints were incomplete, they were good enough to load into AFS for possible matches. A technician took the yellowed photo of the print on the window frame, adjusted contrast so the ridges could be read, and fed the sample into the system. Everyone in the storage room waited in silence, though no one dared hope too much. The scanner ran, analyzed, and compared against tens of thousands of records from other South Dakota counties. After a few minutes the result appeared: no match. Once again the fingerprint served only as an open clue, not an answer. Still, uploading it to AFS turned Child Doe's print into digital data, meaning in the future, as the system grew, or new records were added, it could be recompared automatically, even if investigators forgot it existed. At the same time forensic science was advancing. The Camel cigarette butts recovered under the back window, once a weak piece of evidence in 1949, were re-examined to see if they still held analytical value. New methods like tobacco chemical composition, additives, or filter cutting patterns could potentially reveal smoking habits or product origin. But when the technician opened the envelope containing the two butts, the first problem was obvious. The filters were rotted, the paper darkened, the tobacco separated, far from original condition. Decades without stable temperature and humidity had destroyed most potential for advanced testing. A few basic tests were run, but nothing unique enough to identify an individual emerged. The experts concluded the camel butts could have come from any man in Brookings, Moody, or neighboring counties. Camel was an extremely common brand at the time. The evidence became more ambiguous than ever. While digitizing the file, young investigator Matthew Crowley tried to reconnect the dots Conrad had noted in 1949. He studied the old photos, the back window with its faint print, the trampled grass along the river, the largely decomposed photos of Child Doe, and realized the case still stood exactly where Conrad had left it. Not enough evidence to charge anyone, not enough information to rule anyone out. Yet digitization created one crucial change. The file was no longer just a box gathering dust. It became part of a much larger network of unsolved South Dakota cases, ready to receive cross-matches whenever new samples were entered or records updated. By the late 1990s, when AFS was upgraded and states began linking databases, Child Doe's fingerprint was run again, this time across a wider range. The result was the same: no match with any criminal record in the system. So despite decades of digitization efforts, improved storage, and reanalysis of evidence, nothing had changed the case status. No new leads, no stray clues, no one stepping forward with responsibility or helpful information. As the Annie Whitlow file entered the 21st century, it remained exactly as it had been the day it was frozen: quiet, information poor, and waiting for a miracle no one knew would ever come. Digitizing the case file and re-examining the physical evidence produced no immediate breakthrough, but it did accomplish one critical thing. The Annie Whitlow case, long forgotten in storage, was now placed on the list of files eligible for re-evaluation using next-generation forensic techniques, especially DNA testing. As the new millennium began, advances in genetic analysis opened possibilities that investigators in 1949 could never have imagined. The Child Doe file was immediately added to the list of cold cases scheduled for re-examination. The decision to exhume the 1949 Child Doe remains came after multiple meetings between the Brookings Police Department and the South Dakota State Forensic Laboratory. Exhuming a body buried for more than half a century was no simple matter. It required court orders, county approval, and the presence of supervising experts. Finally, on a cold early autumn morning, a team of forensic specialists, police officers, and legal representatives gathered at the small cemetery where Child Doe had been buried without a name since 1949. When the last layer of soil was removed, the small wooden coffin, now mostly rotted, came into view. The wood had darkened, its surface cracked and splintered, some sections practically disintegrated when lifted. Inside were only skeletal remains with a few patches of dried tissue still clinging to the bones, but for modern science, that was enough. The forensic team carefully collected each bone fragment, taking care not to break anything or cause cross-contamination. The most important pieces were the jaw, teeth, and long bones, the parts that preserve DNA best after decades. The bone samples were placed in specialized containers, sealed to 21st century forensic standards, and transported to the South Dakota Forensic Laboratory. There, technicians began the lengthy process of decontamination, DNA extraction, and genetic sequence reconstruction, a far more time-consuming task than with fresh samples because the DNA had degraded over decades. For weeks, they ran countless cycles of extraction, amplification, and quality testing. Some fragments were completely destroyed, but others, especially from the bone marrow, retained enough genetic signal for analysis. For the first time in decades, the case had a real breakthrough. Child Doe's genetic profile was reconstructed, incomplete but usable with modern methods. In parallel with the DNA work, the forensic team re-evaluated the skeletal features using osteometry and advanced age determination algorithms. They confirmed the age at death as approximately 4 years, an almost perfect match with Annie. They also assessed long bone ratios and the remaining deciduous teeth, concluding the child was a white female of North American ancestry. These findings did not prove identity, but they narrowed the possibilities more than ever before. One detail particularly caught the investigators' attention. The third rib showed signs of an old minor trauma, not a fracture, but possibly a light impact that occurred before death. This injury was never mentioned in the 1949 records, likely because it was hard to see at the time or was obscured by soft tissue. Though not enough to determine cause of death, it suggested forceful contact, possibly from being carried, pulled, or struck during movement. With DNA and osteological analysis complete, the next step was what modern forensics considers revolutionary: preparation for genetic genealogy testing. This method compares an unknown victim's DNA against public genealogy databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, where people voluntarily upload their genetic data. Instead of looking for direct matches, genealogy searches for distant relatives, building the family tree link by link to reveal the true identity. Brookings investigators and forensic experts worked together to create a standardized genetic profile, isolating autosomal DNA segments, the ones most useful for tracing relationships as distant as third or fourth cousins. The report was sent to a specialized genetic genealogy institute in Florida, whose team had helped solve numerous high-profile cold cases. Using the recovered DNA, they began running matches on the genealogy servers. The initial goal was not to find the victim's name, but simply a distant relative. Even a tiny match among millions could point to a family branch and allow investigators to work backward. What Conrad could not do in 1949 was now within reach. After more than half a century, the chance to unlock Child Doe's identity, and with it, reopen the entire Annie Whitlow case, had finally arrived. With the skeleton exhumed and its DNA revived, the Whitlow Child Doe file stood at its biggest turning point since it was frozen in time. A case that appeared to end in 1949 was about to enter a completely new phase, one in which the past would be unlocked by technology from another era. The newly reconstructed Child Doe DNA profile was quickly sent to the genetic genealogy lab in Florida, and from the moment the data was uploaded, a case that seemed forever buried in 1949 entered a completely new chapter. The genealogy team began analyzing every usable autosomal segment, isolating genetic markers that could be compared to the millions of people who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA to public platforms. They did not expect a direct match, virtually impossible in a 70-plus-year-old case, but only needed one solid distant relative to start working backward. In the first round of searches, the system returned only very weak matches, mostly fifth or sixth cousin level, relationships too distant to be useful. But during the second, broader search, one result stood out. A woman living in Minnesota shared several unusually long autosomal segments, indicating a closer-than-average relationship. Genetic distance suggested she could be a third or fourth cousin of child Doe, close enough to build a reverse family tree. The genealogists immediately contacted the woman. She was stunned to learn her DNA was linked to a cold case. With her consent, the team began gathering her complete family history: grandparents, great-grandparents, siblings, cousins, and every side branch documented from the early 20th century onward. The process took weeks. Her family originated in South Dakota and Nebraska, where large farming families and seasonal migration had scattered branches far and wide. Each time a branch was ruled out, the team moved to the next. Little by little, they untangled an enormous family tree. After nearly 2 months, they narrowed the search to one lineage that had lived near Brookings in the late 1940s, a family whose members later migrated to Minnesota and North Dakota after World War II. From there, elimination became easier. They ruled out branches with no young children in 1949, branches that lived too far from Brookings, and focused on the single lineage whose genetic pattern perfectly matched the child Doe sample. That family name was Whitlow. When the genealogy team sent their report to Brookings County, investigators immediately pulled the old files that mentioned the name Whitlow. On the very first page of the 1949 report were the familiar words, "Missing child, Annie Whitlow, age 4. The room went still. After more than 7 decades, DNA had brought them straight back to the name Conrad wrote down 70 years earlier. Still, to confirm identity beyond all doubt, they needed one final step: direct comparison with a close relative of Annie. Among surviving relatives were only nieces and nephews, the next generation after Eleanor Whitlow's siblings. One niece living in Iowa agreed to provide a DNA sample. It was sent to the same lab that had reconstructed child Doe's DNA. The comparison took another 2 weeks. At the end of the month, the final report arrived by fax and secure email. In bold letters it read, "Probability of direct maternal lineage match, 99.98%. Identity conclusion, the remains belong to Annie Whitlow, missing since 1949. The Brookings investigation room fell silent for a few seconds, not from shock, but from the feeling that a door locked for over 70 years had finally swung open. Child Doe 1949 was no longer nameless. She had a name. She had a family. She was the very child that Conrad and the people of Brookings had searched for through those bitter winter weeks of 1949. The missing child case, frozen in 1950, surviving only in the memories of a generation now gone, had just received its first piece of truth: the victim was Annie Whitlow. Confirming her identity opened entirely new investigative paths. Suspects once dismissed for insufficient evidence would be re-evaluated in light of DNA. Items once considered meaningless now had a chance to be reanalyzed with modern methods. Most importantly, the case was officially reopened, no longer a forgotten file. After more than 70 years, Annie had finally come home with her own name. And from this moment, the hunt for whoever caused the tragedy of 1949 entered a completely new chapter, one guided by science rather than intuition or luck. The DNA confirmation that child Doe was Annie Whitlow instantly swung the entire case file back toward the person Conrad had once considered the prime suspect: Harold McDowell. After more than 7 decades, every old record was recovered, digitized, and placed on the table for a complete re-investigation from scratch. No longer scattered 1949 notes, Everything was now cross-referenced with modern forensic technology, allowing Harold's timeline to be examined with unprecedented precision. Investigators began by reconstructing Harold's complete movements in late 1949. Tax records, employment files from the stores where he worked, timesheets, gas receipts, even shopping lists from Brookings stores were re-examined. Those documents had once been fragmented, but when entered into modern case management systems, a far clearer picture of Harold emerged. In November 1949, Harold lived in a simple wooden house on the eastern edge of Brookings, less than half a mile from the Whitlow home. He did seasonal farm work, and had repaired the Whitlow's horse barn only months before Annie disappeared, explaining why his fingerprints were found around their property. But the fact that Harold regularly traveled between Brookings and the lowlands of Moody County, exactly where Annie's body was later found, raised a major red flag. He had both reason and habit to use the very route police now believe the kidnapper took to remove Annie from town. The team tracked down any remaining witnesses, knowing most people alive in 1949 were gone. Still, a few children and grandchildren preserved diaries, letters or stories passed down from their parents. An elderly man from Hartford recalled his father, a gas station owner, saying Harold often stopped for gas in the evening during that period. The daughter of a Brookings shoemaker remembered her father describing a man in a wide-brimmed hat who seemed nervous, visiting the shop the afternoon before Annie vanished. Those small memories alone were not prosecutable evidence, but when combined with modern analysis, they formed a fairly clear pattern of Harold's movements in the days surrounding the incident. At the same time, forensic experts compared the 1949 timelines with the new DNA evidence and updated autopsy conclusions. The estimated time of Annie's death, based on modern bone analysis, fell exactly within the window when Harold had no alibi. His timesheets showed he finished work late afternoon the day before. No one could confirm his whereabouts after about 8 p.m. The store near his house closed at 9 p.m., and none of the night shift clerks remembered seeing him. In other words, the hours from 10 p.m. until dawn were completely unaccounted for. Nothing placed him anywhere other than the Whitlow neighborhood. Using the reconstructed data, investigators simulated Harold's possible route that night, with GIS mapping and 3D terrain modeling. Starting from the Whitlow house, they followed dirt roads through pastures and trails to the edge of the Big Sioux River. The simulation showed the route was perfectly walkable. Someone familiar with the land like Harold could avoid muddy sections. The time required to reach the Moody County dump site matched the forensic window exactly. Investigators also re-examined the two types of soil found on Annie's clothing in 1949, vaguely described in the original report, and discovered the soil from the farms where Harold worked shared mineral composition with samples recovered from the child doe bones. In Conrad's day that detail was useless, but under modern forensic soil analysis, the match became significant. More importantly, the simulation showed Harold was one of the very few people capable of navigating that terrain in the dark. He had worked for years in the grasslands and river valleys. A stranger would have struggled to choose that exact route, let alone maintain the necessary pace to reach Moody County before daylight. None of this delivered an immediate conclusion, but it built a solid foundation to treat Harold as the primary suspect. And the investigation did not stop there. With Annie's DNA confirmed, detectives turned to a new direction, searching the old evidence for the perpetrator's DNA. The pajama fragment, the unknown hairs, and the Camel cigarette butt would now be analyzed with the latest techniques. What happens next will blow open the door Conrad tried, and failed, to open in 1949, because his era simply lacked the tools. Now everything has changed. The new timeline findings on Harold prompted the investigation team to return to the single most important piece of evidence that had once made Conrad suspicious but which he lacked the authority to pursue: the fingerprint lifted from the rear window frame at the Whitlow house in 1949. The original photograph of the print, blurry, broken ridges, deemed unusable at the time, now became the target of a technology Conrad could never have imagined: 3D fingerprint reconstruction, a high-resolution technique for rebuilding incomplete latent prints from photographs. From the start, the forensics team knew this could be the turning point. If that print matched Harold, the entire 70-year investigation would collapse into one single unbroken chain. If it didn't, they would be back to square one. But for the first time since 1949, they had a tool that could deliver a definitive answer. The original fingerprint photograph was rescanned at maximum resolution and fed into a multi-layer image processing system. The software began reconstructing the ridge flow by analyzing contrast, shadowing, the direction of cellulose fibers in the photographic paper, and even the optical distortions caused by the flashbulbs of that era. Every pixel was enhanced, clarifying loops, bifurcations, and ridge endings until a full 3D model of the original latent print emerged. The work took nearly 2 weeks. Some sections were so degraded that the system had to use geometric interpolation based on natural fingerprint patterns, while human examiners checked every detail to prevent artifacts. When the final 3D model was complete, the entire team held its breath. What had once been a gray smudge was now sharp and clear, revealing 11 identifiable minutiae, more than enough for a legal comparison. Next, they pulled Harold's military personnel file from the National Archives, which still contained his inked fingerprint card. That card was digitized and rebuilt in 3D as well. The two models were loaded into the comparison software. The result appeared in seconds, though it took everyone a moment to absorb what it meant. Match confirmed, 11/11ths minutiae, probability of same source, 99.999%. The fingerprint of the person who opened the rear window the night Annie vanished belonged to Harold McDowell. The conference room fell silent. This was not a surprise. Harold had always been the prime suspect, but for the first time in 7 decades, they had courtroom-quality evidence. No more suspicion, no more speculation. A fingerprint that had survived 70 years, once just a faint mark on an old photograph, had become the key that reopened the case. The fingerprint match did not stand alone. The forensics team began tying in every other piece of evidence to build an airtight file. The Camel cigarette butt at the rear window, modern chemical analysis showed nicotine and additive profiles consistent with Camel batches distributed in Brookings in the late 1940s, exactly when Harold lived there. The unknown hair recovered from Annie's skeleton, DNA was heavily degraded, but testing revealed genetic markers more consistent with a male of Northern European descent, matching Harold's known family lineage. The pajama fabric tear histological analysis showed the pull came from a direction perpendicular to a small child's body, consistent with being carried or yanked, matching Mabel's statement. The terrain and route simulation from Harold's location to Moody County matched 100% with the path a local prairie resident could have taken in the dark. None of these items would have been conclusive on its own. Together, they formed an unbreakable logical chain. Harold was at the Whitlow house the night of the disappearance, opened the window, smoked outside, and removed Annie from her bed. When the final report was completed, the investigation team forwarded it to the district attorney's office. The file ran hundreds of pages: fingerprint analysis, scene reconstruction, forensic comparisons, and genealogical evidence. In the final meeting, one question was asked: if Harold were still alive, would this be enough to arrest him? The answer was recorded in the minutes: yes. This file meets full prosecutorial standards for kidnapping and first-degree murder. But Harold McDowell was not alive. He had died more than 20 years earlier. Yet the death of the perpetrator did not close the case. It opened a larger, heavier question: Why would a man close to the Whitlow family do this? And that question would lead the investigation into the next part, where motive, indirect confessions, and long-buried secrets finally come into the light. The absolute fingerprint match left the team with zero doubt that Harold McDowell had been inside the Whitlow house the night Annie disappeared. But to meet the highest modern prosecutorial standard, if Harold were still alive, one final step was required: direct DNA confirmation from Harold himself, rather than relying solely on indirect evidence. Although Harold had been dead for over 2 decades, investigators discovered he was buried in a small cemetery south of Brookings. That opened the last possible avenue to the truth. The FBI stepped in to ensure the process followed strict federal standards for historic cold cases with prosecutorial potential. Within hours of the fingerprint and route analysis being finalized, a federal task force worked with the South Dakota District Attorney and courts to obtain an exhumation order for Harold McDowell's remains. Such orders are rare, and granted only when surrounding evidence has reached an extraordinarily high threshold and the case has major historical value. The warrant was signed in under 48 hours, a speed that reflected the strength of the new forensic results. At the Brookings Cemetery, on a damp, cold morning, forensic anthropologists followed a process nearly identical to the earlier exhumation of child doe, removing soil, opening the casket, and collecting samples from bones most likely to retain DNA, typically the femur, jaw, and teeth. Every step was filmed, samples were sealed, and federal chain of custody protocols were observed. When the first samples reached the lab, the team knew they were standing at the moment that could end a 74-year mystery. The federal lab extracted DNA from Harold's bones, genetic material from someone dead that long is usually badly degraded, but modern techniques produced a profile complete enough for comparison. The samples were run in parallel with the remaining DNA from the unknown hair on Annie's skeleton, fabric cells on the pajama fragment, a microscopic skin cell found on the inside of the window frame, something 1949 technology could never have detected. For hours the sequencers processed segment after segment, flagging every matching marker. That evening, a preliminary report went to the FBI. Partial match detected. Probability of shared source extremely high, but the team could not declare closure on a partial profile. They needed a full result at the modern prosecutorial threshold of 99.99%. The lab ran expanded panels, using fragment recovery protocols proven in famous cold cases nationwide. 2 days later, the final report arrived at the Brookings Investigation Office. Match confirmed. 28/28 ELOCI. Source DNA, Harold McDowell. Conclusion: biological material recovered from the 1949 crime scene originated from Harold McDowell. In that moment, every piece from 7 decades finally locked into place: the fingerprint, the camel butt, the travel route, the time of death, the pajama fiber damage, and now absolute DNA. There were no gaps left for doubt, no shadows left unexplained. The Annie Whitlow case now had a positively identified perpetrator, confirmed by the most advanced forensic science available. Even though Harold was dead, a full prosecutorial file was still prepared. The state court requested a posthumous indictment to formally record that, had Harold lived, he would have been charged with kidnapping of a minor first-degree murder, evidence tampering and unlawful entry, concealment of a corpse. The indictment was completed not to try a dead man, but to restore historical justice, so Annie's family, the Brookings community, and the desperate 1949 investigators would know the truth had finally been proven. And with that DNA conclusion, the story moved to its next critical phase, the phase where investigators finally had to answer the last question: what drove Harold McDowell to commit such a brutal crime? The DNA result, proving Harold McDowell left biological traces at the 1949 crime scene elevated the case from historical investigation to absolute priority status. Although Harold was now very elderly and living quietly in a retirement community south of Sioux Falls, modern legal procedure required an arrest before formal charges could be filed once probable cause was established. This was not only a legal step, it was a powerful message to the community. A 74-year-old case had been officially reopened. In the early morning of March 12, 2024, a convoy of FBI and South Dakota State Police vehicles pulled up to the small wooden house where Harold lived with his grandson. The sky was overcast, patches of snow still clinging to the roof, echoing the cold winter feel of 1949 when Annie vanished. A tactical team approached the front door, followed by 3 FBI agents carrying the arrest warrant. Harold, now over 90, answered the door slowly, slightly stooped with age. When he saw the line of officers in his yard, he froze for just a second, an expression many would later say showed he knew exactly what was coming. The lead agent read clearly, "Harold McDowell, you are under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Annie Whitlow in 1949. In that moment, Harold showed no outburst, no attempt to deny. He simply looked at the ground, hands trembling slightly as the cuffs went on. His grandson stood behind the half-open door, stunned as he watched a scene his family had never imagined. None of them had known Harold carried that secret for 70 years. Arresting a living Harold, even at extreme age, carried major legal weight. It allowed police to complete a modern prosecution file instead of issuing only a posthumous finding. With the arrest executed, the Brookings County State's attorney announced they would file full charges in South Dakota court. That same afternoon, authorities held a packed press conference at Brookings Police Headquarters. Local and national reporters filled the room. The head of the investigation declared, "The 1949 disappearance of Annie Whitlow has been officially reopened. Modern DNA, fingerprint, and forensic analysis confirmed suspect Harold McDowell." The statement aired on every newscast that day, marking the first time in nearly a century the public heard the name Annie Whitlow, not as an unsolved mystery, but as a case with an answer. Harold's indictment file was completed within 2 weeks of the arrest. Prosecutors compiled every piece of evidence, full DNA match to 1949 crime scene material, 3D reconstructed fingerprint, absolute match to Harold, simulated travel route, consistent with Harold's capabilities and residence history, historical data including inmate statements, camel smoking habit, and ties to the Whitlow family, new forensic analysis of the pajama and unknown hair forming a complete logical chain. When the file reached the court, the prosecutor noted in the hearing record, should the defendant remain competent for trial, the existing evidence fully meets the standard for first-degree murder prosecution. Meanwhile, the Brookings community grappled with complex emotions. Some elderly residents, who had been children in 1949, expressed relief that the truth was finally known. Several said they remembered seeing Harold on the prairie that year, and had always thought he seemed off. Younger families hearing the story for the first time could not believe a case that old could still be solved. As for Harold, because of his advanced age and frail health, he was transferred to a detention facility with constant medical supervision. No one knew whether he would live long enough to stand trial, but that no longer changed the essence of the case. The truth had been established, and the legal process had been completed exactly as it would for any living suspect. With Harold under arrest, the story reached its most critical juncture, the historic trial, where the events of 1949 would be recounted with modern evidence, before South Dakota finally turned the last page on a case everyone once believed would never end. Harold McDowell's formal arrest in March 2024 paved the way for a historic trial that South Dakota had never seen before, a crime from 74 years earlier, reconstructed entirely through modern forensic science. Once the indictment was finalized, the Brookings County Court quickly set a date for the preliminary hearing. The courtroom was packed with reporters, experts, and a handful of elderly residents who still remembered that snowy morning in 1949 when news of Annie's disappearance swept through the town. From the very first session, the prosecution laid out its strategy. Every piece of forensic evidence, fingerprints, DNA, genetic genealogy, timeline, and physical items, would be presented as an unbroken chain, step by step recreating Harold's actions on the night Annie vanished. This was not simply about charging an elderly man, it was about establishing historical truth with 21st-century tools. The first expert called was a federal forensic technician who had personally used 3D fingerprint reconstruction technology to restore the print found on the Whitlow's rear window frame. He explained the process to the jury, scanning the faint 1949 fingerprint photograph, enhancing resolution through algorithmic analysis, building a 3D model of every ridge, comparing it to Harold's military fingerprint record. When the large courtroom screen displayed the two models, one from the 1949 photo, one from Harold, and the system highlighted 11 out of 11 points of perfect match, many in the room stopped breathing for a moment. The prosecutor concluded, "No one but Harold McDowell opened that window that night." Next, the DNA experts presented analyses performed on the unknown hair recovered from Annie's skeleton, tissue fibers clinging to a pajama fragment, skin cells collected from the rear window frame, and a direct DNA sample taken from Harold's remains. The report displayed in court showed 28 out of 28 loci matched, absolute certainty, by federal forensic standards. The expert concluded, the remaining evidence from the 1949 file contains DNA originating from Harold McDowell. There is no second possibility. The following presentation came from the genetic genealogy team. They recounted tracing distant relatives from genealogy databases until they confirmed with 99.98% probability through the maternal line that child Doe was Annie Whitlow. This report did not directly implicate Harold, but it formed the foundation to prove the victim was Annie, and the body disposal route matched a path Harold could have taken. Once forensics had established two pillars, the victim was Annie and Harold, left DNA fingerprints at the scene, the prosecution moved to the next part, Harold's timeline on the night in 1949. They presented Harold's movement records, townspeople's accounts of seeing him around Brookings that day, his Camel cigarette habit, and the ash at the rear window, a simulated route that perfectly fit from the Whitlow house to the Big Sioux River, and a 1950 jailhouse informant's statement that Harold once bragged about carrying a sleeping little girl. Although the informant's statement lacked standalone value, it became corroborating evidence when placed alongside the DNA, fingerprints, and route. Harold's defense attorney argued, Harold had worked at the Whitlow house, so the fingerprint could have been left earlier. The hair and DNA might have been cross-contaminated through old evidence. Genealogy did not prove Harold was the killer. The prosecution immediately countered, the window fingerprint showed characteristics of a fresh print, inconsistent with work done many months earlier. Harold's DNA matched skin cells embedded inside the wood grain, impossible through cross-contamination. Harold's timeline had no alibi and aligned perfectly with the new forensics. No one else but Harold appeared at that window that night. The defense could not break a single link in the chain. As the trial moved into preliminary findings, the judge declared, fingerprints, DNA, genealogy, physical evidence, and timeline all point to one single individual. This is the most unified forensic case file this court has ever reviewed in a historical case. With each piece of evidence presented clearly and cohesively, the 1949 case became the first in history with full legal grounds to establish criminal responsibility. And from here, the case moved to its final stage, the verdict, and the community shockwave that would erupt after more than 7 decades of waiting for the truth. The closing arguments between prosecution and defense ended in a courtroom so tense almost no one dared breathe heavily. When the judge returned to the bench, and asked everyone to rise, the room fell into absolute silence. Everything that had unfolded over weeks, fingerprints, DNA, genealogy, timeline, physical evidence, and supporting testimony, now converged on this single moment. The judge opened the verdict, speaking slowly but firmly, emphasizing each word as if to affirm that justice can take 7 decades but never stops. Based on the entirety of the modern forensic evidence, the court finds Harold McDowell guilty of kidnapping resulting in death, under current federal standards and the historical prosecution clause of the state of South Dakota. A soft collective exhale rippled through the public gallery. A few people raised hands to their mouths, not from surprise, but because a truth long thought buried forever had finally been spoken aloud, clear and undeniable. Though Harold was far too old and frail to serve any real sentence, and his health had kept him from appearing much in court, this verdict was not about punishment. It was about recording the truth, and closing a 74-year cycle of a child abduction crime. The prosecution had argued the court had full authority to issue a sentence on 2 legal grounds. First, crimes involving kidnapping and resulting death have no statute of limitations in the U.S. legal system. Second, once DNA, fingerprints, and modern forensic modeling confirmed the perpetrator's identity, the court could render a verdict regardless of the suspect's advanced age or inability to serve the sentence. The judge cited a series of federal precedents, allowing posthumous adjudication, that is, legal conclusion in historical cases to establish criminal responsibility and protect the rights of victims and their families. Harold's case was no exception. It became one of the landmark rulings showing how modern courts handle cold cases spanning decades or even centuries. In his final remarks, the judge stressed, the court did not rely on speculation. The court relied on a complete forensic system. That system included 3D fingerprint, with 11/11 matching points, meeting absolute legal standards. Harold's DNA, found in tissue and remaining skin cells at the scene. Genealogy confirming the victim's identity, thereby establishing the correct investigative path. Route simulation coinciding with Harold's possible movements, the night of the incident. Camel cigarette ash, the act of carrying Annie, and the informant's statement fitting the forensic timeline. Not a single piece of evidence contradicted the theory that Harold was the perpetrator. On the contrary, everything pointed to one single point, what the judge called absolute forensic convergence. Before adjourning, the judge read one sentence that silenced the entire room. For a child robbed of her voice in 1949, justice has now spoken on her behalf. The trial ended not with applause, but with deep, profound silence, the kind that only falls when a community finally sets down a burden it has carried for nearly a century. The verdict had been delivered. The truth had been established. Justice had arrived, however late. And from here, South Dakota prepared to enter the final chapter, the community aftermath following this history-shaking ruling. The guilty verdict against Harold McDowell echoed across South Dakota like a voice returning from the past. Though he was too frail to serve time and the crime had occurred 75 years earlier, this legal confirmation unleashed a wave of deep emotion in Brookings and Moody County, 2 communities that had shared a collective haunting over Annie Whitlow's disappearance, a case many believed would never be solved. In Brookings, the elderly, children who once heard their parents talk about the night the wind took Annie, now in their 80s and 90s, said the verdict felt like an old wound finally stitched closed. In Moody County, where Annie's remains were discovered in 1949, local authorities held a small memorial by the Big Sioux River. Many families brought flowers to the spot marked as the discovery site of Child Doe 1949. For many residents, solving the case was not just the resolution of a mystery, it was a moving reminder that justice can be very slow, but it always finds its way back. One of the quietest yet most important effects of the verdict was clearing the names of those suspected during the 1940s investigation. Especially Eleanor's former boyfriend and several others questioned without modern forensic tools. Modern investigative records concluded none of them had any connection to Annie's death. Their descendants thanked law enforcement for finally ending generations of baseless rumors. The Annie Whitlow case brought systemic change to South Dakota's investigative practices. After the trial, the State Department of Justice issued new guidelines on long-term evidence preservation standards, digitizing case files within the first 24 hours, storing biological samples to federal standards, performing DNA analysis even in unidentified victim cases, automating fingerprint comparison systems for cold cases. Many investigators said the case was clear proof of the value of never discarding evidence, no matter how small or faint. A Minnehaha County sheriff told the press conference, "If Conrad hadn't kept that 1949 fingerprint photo, we wouldn't have today." The Annie Whitlow case quickly entered national forensic training curricula as a classic example of the power of multi-layered forensics, the interconnection of fingerprints, DNA, genealogy, timeline, and how technology can crack a case that appeared to have nothing left to investigate. Professional articles analyzing the case described it as a perfect illustration of how genealogy can establish victim identity, while DNA and fingerprints establish perpetrator identity. Two investigative paths once completely separate, now combined into the most powerful 21st century case-breaking tool. The final verdict was not only an affirmation of Harold McDowell's guilt, it also restored identity to a child once buried as Child Doe, re-established historical truth for a community carrying pain for 75 years, returned clarity to those wrongly suspected, proved the importance of long-term evidence preservation, and above all, reinforced the value of modern forensics as the strongest tool for solving cold cases today. Brookings, where the story began, has returned to its quiet life. But in the small park near where Annie once played, residents erected a stone marker engraved, "For Annie, justice found its way home." That message is not only for a child robbed of her future in 1949, but for every generation that believes no matter how much time passes, the truth always finds a way back. The Annie Whitlow story, a case frozen for nearly 75 years, and then solved through modern forensics, DNA and genealogy, is not just a historical tragedy. It reflects issues that remain very real in American life today: the fragility of child safety, the importance of data preservation, and a community's responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. In the story, Annie disappeared in just minutes from a home thought to be safe in Brookings, a reminder that there is never a moment when it'll be fine. Applies to small children. An unlocked front door, an open back window, and small noises in the night that went unnoticed, created the opening Harold McDowell exploited. Today, American families still face similar risks, and the clear lesson is safety is not the default, it is active effort. Locking doors, installing yard lights and cameras, and teaching young children how to react when they feel danger are practical measures. The story also shows the value of preserving data and evidence even when it seems useless. A faint 1949 fingerprint photo, a rotted camel filter, a torn pajama scrap, all appeared worthless at the time, yet became the foundation for solving the case with modern technology. In a country increasingly dependent on data, this is a reminder that storage systems, from paper records and medical files to digital data, must be rigorously protected. Finally, the genealogy aspect highlights something very American. The community has a role in solving crimes. One Minnesota resident voluntarily uploading DNA unlocked the entire case. It shows that when society cooperates, from sharing data, noticing anomalies, to supporting investigations, justice can arrive, even late. The ultimate lesson: justice may be slow, but it depends on the small choices of every individual in the community. Thank you for following the entire 75-year case-breaking journey. If you love forensic and cold case stories like Annie Whitlow's, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next videos. See you in the next case, where we'll continue exploring how the truth always finds its way back, no matter how much time has passed.